Hello, I'm Tim Smolens, and today I'm going to show you how I approximated the infamous Phil Spector's famous wall of sound production style of the 1960s, while still recording in a modern computer-based DAW, making good use of certain effects plugins. If you like the content on my channel, please take a second to help this little thing grow. Hit that notification bell and turn it to all, ring it, whatever it says. Before showing you my production techniques to attempt this recreation of the wall of sound, a brief history is in order. The wall of sound is a formulaic approach to music production that was made by Phil Spector initially in the 1960s, and it utilized live performances by large ensembles of some of the A-list session musicians of the day, the core of which became known as the Wrecking Crew, and who incidentally played on a huge number of the radio hits of the 1960s, while the public thought that the band in the pictures was playing the songs. No, in fact, the best dudes in the world at playing in the studio are playing the songs, and that's why, maybe one of the reasons why you guys like them so much, who knows. But there is a great documentary on the Wrecking Crew that I encourage you to take in. The Wall of Sound set out to exploit the possibilities of studio recording to create an abnormally dense orchestral timbre, but that would also translate well to the radios and sound equipment of the era. This was before it was hi-fi and super loud systems, systems that sounded really good when you cranked them up. This is a little more tinty, even still in the 60s, although it was starting to improve. But the Wall of Sound in that regard was a stunning success because the sound carried perfectly in its mono waveform right to whatever system they had going those days. Spector said something in 64 where he said, "I was looking for a sound so strong that if the material was not the greatest, the sound would carry the record. It was a case of augmenting, it all fit together like a jigsaw." Wow. I personally find the art of music production at its best does have that ability to elevate even mediocre songs to a new level. Obviously, that's not the goal. I don't want to just do lame songs that sound so good that they're awesome, but it's better, to pair a good song with a good production. But what a little factory Spector had going here, where even the songs that were mediocre, sounded good. Listen to the entire Wall of Sound catalog. Some songs are simply better than others, but man, they all sounded amazing. They all sounded absolutely unbelievable. I highly encourage you all to listen to this little Wall of Sound catalog just from a production standpoint. Forget about the actual song. If any of you need an example of what the Wall of Sound sounds like, maybe some of you aren't quite as familiar, try listening to a bit of Be My Baby by the Ronettes, and then Wait Until My Bobby Gets Home by Darlene Love, and then finish it off with Da Do Run Run by the Crystals. Man, that Wall of Sound sounds good. Let's talk about recording methods. Phil Spector's approach called for large ensembles to record live in the same large studio room with multiple instruments doubling or even tripling the parts to create a fuller, richer tone. For example, Phil often duplicated the piano part with maybe a harpsichord and an electric piano. The three, once they were mixed together, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them, and it would just create this illusion of a unique, novel, this instrument that didn't exist. Brian Wilson, genius leader of the Beach Boys, would later take that idea to a whole new level on Pet Sounds and Smile. Phil did incorporate a large array of orchestral instruments such as string sections, woodwinds, brass, percussion, things that were not previously heard on, some of the youth-oriented pop music of the day and in the years that had led up to this. The sound of the reverb from the legendary Gold Star Studios echo chamber was one of the hallmarks of the Wall of Sound. A high-fidelity loudspeaker would be placed in this perfectly designed cavernous room. Sounds were fed into the speaker from the mixing board, and they were captured by at least two microphones, one that was near that speaker and one that was at the end of the chamber, capturing that entire echo. The chamber was just one of the rooms at the same studio where the musicians were performing, so if they were in this big tracking room over here, maybe, I'm not sure how it was laid out, but down the hall there was that echo chamber, and wires were piped into that room. Phil said that he was taking a Wagnerian approach to rock and roll, writing little symphonies for kids. That's pretty funny. The combination of large ensembles with reverberation effects created a type of cohesion and fluidity among the instruments that is really hard to reproduce using our modern ultra clean methods of overdubbing separately, onto computer software programs and ultra pristine high fidelity. That is not what they were doing back then. So when everyone was recording in that same room, the saxophone was just sitting over here and the flute's over here and the saxophone would bleed into the flute mic. Today we might think, oh, I don't have, enough separation, but it actually sounds better because it sounds realistic. If the sax is over here and in the flute mic over here, you're hearing a little bit of that sax. That's actually creating more fluidity among the instruments in the mix. The drums would even be in the same room, and everything would be bleeding into those drum overhead mics, which were the main mics they were probably using on those drums because it wasn't like super close mic'd. Some of those instruments were being blasted through that echo chamber and creating all this space, and then other instruments were like bone dry. You'll hear like a saxophone solo come in, and there is not a hint of reverb on it, but the castanets and the background vocals or the string section are blasting through that echo chamber. Deciding which instruments are going to be super wet and dry is a pretty cool thing. The other thing they were doing was committing to a mix on the spot. So they, had all of these musicians playing in one room in a tracking studio and all the microphones that were feeding into this mixing board, and they were getting their EQ and compression settings. But as the ensemble was warming up and they were maybe doing one take, two take, the engineers and the producers are in there adjusting, the sound of the mix going to tape. But that mix going to tape, they couldn't change it. It was just a mono mix, going to one track of a 3-track tape. I think they were using an Ampex 3-track back in those days. They would do one track would be the music, and then maybe the other 2 tracks would be vocals. Because there might be background vocals and then the lead vocals. Despite the trend toward multi-channel recording, Spector was very opposed to stereo releases, claiming that it took control of the record sound away from the producer in favor of the listener, resulting in an infringement of the wall of sound's carefully balanced combination of sonic textures as they were meant to be heard. Brian Wilson agreed, stating, "I look at sound like a painting. You have a balance, and a balance is conceived in your mind. You finish the sound, dub it down, and you've stamped out a picture of your balance with the mono dub down. But in stereo, you leave that dub down to the listener, to his speaker placement and speaker balance. It just doesn't seem complete to me." Wow. So Phil and Brian wanted mono. The intricacies of Phil Spector's production techniques were unprecedented in the field of popular music. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was maybe the only producer to blatantly become a student of the wall of sound, obsessively analyze it, and go on to take it to a whole new level on Pet Sounds and 1967's mysterious and unfinished enigma of recorded history, Smile. According to Brian Wilson, who used the formula extensively, in the 40s and 50s, arrangements were considered, okay, here, listen to that French horn, or listen to the string section now. It was all a definite sound. There weren't combinations of sound, and the advent of Phil Spector, we found sound combinations, which, scientifically speaking, is a brilliant aspect of sound production. I love that. That is really, really good. Read that again. Rewind. I'm not going to say it, but rewind. Brian, using his rising star status with the Beach Boys, used to loiter at Phil Spector recording sessions and observe as much as he could to see what he could discover about the secret sauce for Phil's process. Sometimes it was like outside the studio door, he was just listening in. It is said he may have even been pulled into a few sessions to record either some piano or hand claps, no one's quite sure. Brian has said that Spector's production of Be My Baby was his favorite recording ever. Take a listen to the Beach Boys' Don't Worry Baby, which is clearly an homage to that song, yet it's totally original and unique, all on its own. Wilson considered Pet Sounds to be his concept album centered around interpretations of Phil Spector's recording methods. Author Dominique Priore notes that Brian took the wall of sound in a different, more personal direction. Where Phil would go for a total effect by bringing the music to the edge of cacophony, which is true, Brian seemed to prefer more clarity. His production method was to spread out the sound and arrangement, giving the music a more lush, comfortable feel. You know, if Brian decided there was going to be like an oboe on Waiting for the Day, you're going to hear that oboe. And the wall of sound is really just this blare of a bunch of instruments. It's awesome, but it is very different than Pet Sounds. Yet Pet Sounds is clearly influenced by that wall of sound, or it is derived from it. It's just becoming more specific. According to Spector's preferred audio engineer, who was named Larry Levine, Brian was one of the few people in the music business Phil respected. There was mutual respect. Brian might say that he learned how to produce from watching Phil, but the truth is he was already producing records before he observed Phil. He just wasn't getting credit for it, something that in the early days, I remember, used to make Phil angry. Phil would tell anybody who listened that Brian was one of the great producers. Let me talk about how I approached recreating the wall of sound. Since there's no way for me to record the same way as Phil Spector did and achieve a similar result without tens of thousands of dollars to spare at the least, I had to do some guesswork. Let me explain how I approached producing this song that you're about to hear. It's called She's a Girl, and it pays homage to the wall of sound and to Brian's extension of it, and at the same time becomes my own personal sound, I guess. For an example, I am using a song I wrote called She's a Girl, which is the title track for an album I released in 2018, and it's available at timsmolens.com or on Bandcamp. Tim Smolens. When you hear this song, you will clearly hear an homage and usage of themes from the Beach Boys' Heroes and Villains, a very similar chord progression on the verse, the same iconic background vocal line, and even the trombone line. Other than that, this almost 10-minute song is almost entirely original, but it does utilize the Heroes and Villains background music motif, and it's very intentional, so don't let that throw you off, and most of the rest of the song is entirely original. The idea of imitating or copying something, a lot of people think that copying or imitating is lame. Oh, that's they copied that person, but I've just never thought of things like that. You take these things, you become obsessed with them, you sort of put them together and mix them up and add your own style into it, and it becomes something, of its own. Brian was obsessed with the Four Freshmen in the beginning. He was obsessed with Spector's production, probably a whole bunch of other things he was obsessed with, but it made for some great forging of things that didn't usually go together. You think Brian's groove do 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 for Heroes and Villains was original? Pause now and listen to the first 20 seconds of Phil Spector's production for the song Little Boy by the Crystals. It is pretty much Heroes and Villains exactly. It's almost certain that Brian decided to use that song as the basic feel for Heroes and Villains. Who cares? It sounds great. He took a little motif, he turned it into something entirely different, this like cowboy and western type of thing, which is totally different than what it was doing in the song Little Boy. Music is a game of mimicry. There's 12 notes in our system. We combine, different obsessions and proclivities and forge, our own unique sound from that. So I see nothing wrong with all of these obsessions that people develop. Without further ado, we are going to break down the massive production of my song She's a Girl and show how I approximated the wall of sound to the best of my ability using modern recording techniques, but also making it my own stylistically. I will break down sections and isolate small instrument combinations, solo them to demonstrate my approach. Let's start with the rhythm section and specifically the drums. Drums, in this case, I could have used real drums, but I didn't really have much of a budget, and there is a convenience to using MIDI, not to mention an ever-improving sample library. I opted to use MIDI in this case. Drums in the 60s did not dominate mixes like they do today. They kind of sat back in the mix, and you could hear them, but they didn't really dominate the gain structure the way they do now. In the 70s, they started to get a little louder. In the 80s, they got louder with metal and electronic, or drum machines. 90s and new metal drums got even louder, so drums have been getting nothing but louder. In the 60s, they really weren't that loud. You couldn't even hear the kick drum unless there was some sort of break in the music for just the drums. It was more of room mics, not really close mics, and the drummer was playing in the room with some of the other musicians, which made for some really great bleeding into the microphones. For the drums in this song, I used Contact by Native Instruments, probably the most popular sample player there is, to trigger some really amazing samples of old drum kits that were recorded at Abbey Road Studios using both drum kits and miking techniques from the 50s and 60s. Pretty cool plugin, honestly. So let me just show you what these two look like. There's the 60s drummer. I don't remember which one I even used, honestly, or there's the 50s drummer. And they all have the same mapping, so you can just interchange and see which kit you like the best. There's tons of features and ways to tweak the sound to your liking. Since the drum parts in the 60s were not complex, I felt comfortable sequencing it with MIDI. It is kind of lame. I never prefer MIDI over real players, but sometimes it saves money, and if these samples weren't that good, maybe I wouldn't have done it. Who knows? I think drum beats in that era, especially the Spector Wall of Sound and Brian Wilson and a lot of the stuff in the 60s, they weren't like drum beats now where you have a hi-hat and a kick drum and snare. They didn't really use the hi-hat or the ride cymbal the way we do now. Instead, Phil Spector and Brian Wilson would let that role of the hi-hat or the ride cymbal be played by things like castanets or triangle, tambourine, hand clap, shaker. That's not really done that much anymore, but the drummer would focus more on like kick, snare, and oftentimes the snare would have the floor tom at the same time. Boom, and add their little sort of groovy swing fills, but sort of like this, just kick and snare, but the snare has the floor tom. Going through these echo chamber plugins I have queued up here, and it might not sound that great by itself, but I think you'll hear once I start layering the stuff on, the drums are not really integral to being some loud part of the music. Very simple. So would real drums have sounded better? Probably, but considering music from the Wall of Sound was not very drum heavy, it just made sense to sequence these with MIDI parts and quantize it just enough to have a good feel and be on time and in the groove without over quantizing it. It sounds mechanical if you do that. Usually to me, it's somewhere between 27% and 40% that you quantize it. It really depends actually how well you played it in. If you're a really good player, you don't need to quantize the rhythm as much. My keyboard rhythm's a little squirrely, so I made it do it a little bit more, like 30, 33%. In Digital Performer, the DAW I use, there's lots of other abstract and useful quantized parameters. Sometimes even adding a little bit of swing, even if it's not a swing part, you can add 15% swing or 20% swing, and it's just going to sound like regular eighth notes that have a little bit of a swing to them. Working our way down the rhythm section, let's try bass, or in this case, basses. For Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, there are likely multiple basses, such as stand-up, picked bass, could be a P bass or a hollow body bass, but honestly, the bass is not super distinct in the Wall of Sound, so it is a little bit hard to tell. On Brian Wilson productions, such as Pet Sounds album, the bass does carve out a little bit of a clearer role, especially on songs like Sloop John B, where it occupies almost a lead type of bass role. But oftentimes on Pet Sounds, there are multiple basses, stand-up, electric, who knows, a couple other things. Sometimes a piano would join in for a section on bass on the low part. I decided to lay down 4 different parts, and it's definitely clearer than anything you'd find in the Wall of Sound, something closer to Pet Sounds, but I was kind of looking for something to poke through the mix a little bit, so there I am changing up the formula already on recreating the Wall of Sound. Even when you set out to copy something, if you're an artist or whatever, you're probably just going to add your own thing to it right away, so by the time you get to the end of this, it's going to be sort of its own beast. So yeah, that's the philosophy I use on that stuff. So there's 4 basses. We got stand up. Let's check that out. And you're going to notice that Heroes and Villains bass line because this verse pays homage to that. It's an easy line, but it's hard to groove it on the bass. And I'm always amazed when I listen back to stand up parts. I played that part on my bass. just what a noisy damn instrument it is. There's always these clicks and clacks, and then the guy, me is breathing. You can't breathe, you should be breathing like, but instead it's like boom 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 boom. It's yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of healthier cardio method I could use, but a bass is a noisy thing. It really is. Listen to this. Hear how the tone I chose was not too much low, thundering low end, because I know it's just going to blend into these other four basses. So I wanted it to have that distinct mid-range, woody type of bass vibe, and I had to use an EQ that really accentuates that high mid and low mid to get that sound. Next, I used, I think, a Stingray. It almost has a P-bass type of sound, but it's before I'd gotten my P-bass. Here, this green one. Oh man, who cares? Anyway. Let's blend that with the stand-up. One cool thing about, an instrument like stand-up, because it's fretless, is you're going to get those pitch anomalies where, you don't play it perfectly in tune, and the electric is more of a fixed pitch. So you are going to hear those little bit of phasing, which is kind of part of the cool sound of doubled. Man, going back to that stand-up bass, I'm always amazed at how much click track I need to play a good stand-up bass part, and it always bleeds through the darn headphones into the mic. You never really hear it in the mix, but whenever I solo this instrument, I'm always like, oh man, that's a lot of click. It's kind of annoying. So I add in that Stingray picked. Okay, then I have a hollow body, and this might think this is kind of cheesy, but this is actually a sample that I made from this really old hollow body that was actually Trace Bruins's bass that he lent for me for a while. Really funky old bass. I think he does use that on some of the Secret Chiefs recordings, like the beginning of Second Grand Constitution. What is that? Songs such as the Rose Garden Mystery and many more. Anyway, I sampled that bass, and you're going to be able to hear it's MIDI just because the articulations aren't realistic, but the tone is really cool. And I mean, it just blended back into the other ones, but it sounds like this. You can tell it's MIDI. Like the playing, the articulation, yeah, it's totally MIDI. But listen to that tone, it's pretty cool. And then when I blend it back into the stand-up, and this, you're not going to notice that it's MIDI. I mean, come on. I'm letting you guys in on under the hood now, all the cheating I'm doing. I actually have a hollow body bass now, that one right there. So I could have played it, I just didn't have the instrument at the time. So next time. Then for some definition, and Spector definitely would have done this, would not have done this. I did a low guitar doing kind of surfy bass notes to really let it poke out. Spector would not have done that. Brian did do some stuff more like that, and this is honestly more pronounced than anything he probably would have done too. You'll hear, how it fits into the mix and decide whether you think it's cool or not. So let's listen to all four of those basses together. Solo that surf one for you. It's an octave up, so that damn click track, man, in the stand-up. Okay. All right, let's bring in the drums and hear how those sound together, the drums and the basses. Having that surfy picked guitar bass is really an aesthetic choice. I think it ended up working in the song you'll hear later, but if I was building the mix from scratch, I would probably say, I don't even know if I would use that right now, but this was years ago when I mixed it, so I used it then, but... Definitely helps it cut by the time I get all the other instruments in. But yeah, it's definitely a choice and a cool option to have as a timbre, but you don't have to use, everything you record. That's one lesson that I've learned the hard way many times. Just because you spend time, developing a part or recording it or taking the pains to lay it down, it doesn't mean you have to use it. But anyway, Heroes and Villains had this dun dun dun, this really simple piano part. I wanted to get something like that going. So here is the piano. Yeah, throughout Spector's productions and Brian's, there's oftentimes pianos or keyboards or multiple things playing some simple comping pattern like that to create an instrument. In this case, the verse, I'm still on here, is an homage to Heroes and Villains. So the main, if you listen to that Heroes and Villains backing track, it is a muddy mess. You hear a snare, you hear like, it's hard to tell what it is. You hear an acoustic guitar kind of creating that cowboy vibe. So I decided to record 3 acoustic guitars just because I didn't have one good one that I thought would really cut and sound. So I was trying to make it sound like a single, larger than life acoustic guitar. So anyway, I do some pre-mixing sometimes. I'll just record 2 tracks and then I'll mix them together with the EQ settings I like. It appears I did that on this 2 acoustic guitars here. So let's hear what that sounds like. It's a nice tone, not too much, not too boomy or anything. Now I did another acoustic guitar, which was this like little one I have over there, which is like a kid's model. I was like just looking for a different tone. That one sounds like this. Definitely not as good of a tone, but it's going to add something else to it. So now let's add both of those 3 guitars together. Without the kid guitar. With a lot of very mid-rangey, so that's why I didn't use much of it, I think. Anyway, let's add that back into the drums and the basses. We need the piano as well. And those of you familiar with Heroes and Villains, obviously I'm just basically mimicking the instrumentation of that particular verse. As this song goes on, it goes in a million different wild directions, but I really wanted to nail that basic Heroes and Villains vibe. You can hear the bass sounds nice. I can hear it pretty well. Spector has a bunch of songs like this. Like I said before, go listen to the song Little Boy. I think that's by the Crystals. Man, it's the same exact groove. So this stuff is, going around. Everyone takes it and does their own little version of it. So it's no big deal. Okay, there's one more component. Like I said, the Heroes and Villains backing track mix is very muddy. It's not one of Brian's, best works as far as clarity. Pet Sounds mostly sounds much clearer. Some people think he had played these tapes for so many times overdubbing that the quality started to go down. I'm not sure. But when you go back and listen to the Heroes and Villains backing track, take a minute to do that now. It is not very clear. You can hear a snare drum. You can hear that there's something like an acoustic guitar that really gives this Western vibe. And then the next thing I think you hear most clearly in the mix is, oddly enough, a cello doing not exactly the bass line. So if the bass is going doom, doo, doo, I think the cello is going like doom, doom, doo, doo, doo. So the cello part, which I played, is doing this. Take that out. Yeah, I mean, Brian wanted this Cowboys and Indians vibe, this Heroes and Villains vibe. I don't know. I think that cello, as simple as that part is, just look what it does to the part. Without it. With it. I want to talk about percussion. Percussion in the Wall of Sound was absolutely huge. Both Phil and Brian would put together these large ensembles. You'd have the drummer, you'd have things like tambourine, hand clap, woodblock, triangle, timpani, all kinds of stuff, really. Shakers. There would be, huge ensembles of percussion for some of these songs, and it's really one of the hallmarks of the Wall of Sound. So for this particular tune, as it turns from the first verse to chorus, I wanted to change the vibe from Heroes and Villains to Be My Baby. And Be My Baby uses that principle I said before, where the drummer does not play a hi-hat. No hi-hat at all. The drummer goes doom, 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 doom. And you have something else, some other percussion play the role of the hi-hat. In the case of Be My Baby, it is this brilliant shaker that's also going through the echo chamber. It just has such a beautiful, rich sound and really takes the place of that hi-hat beautifully. So that sounds like this, the shaker part. Coming up right here. Pause here and listen to Be My Baby. You're going to hear, I can't remember which shaker I used. I have about 3 of them. I probably had to line up that performance because I'm no master percussionist. And although that sounds easy, when you try to play that on some of those shakers, there's that delay. And who knows what I did, what kind of studio lining up the audio wizardry I did. But it sounds pretty good. And then you can't have a wall of sound without a tambourine. So let's hear what the tambourine sounds like with the shaker. I think I used 2 different tambourines in this case. There's I have multiple, so. Oh yeah, that sounds way different than this one. Okay, back down to the right level with the shaker. Yeah, it was definitely, this song from section to section, I used different songs of Phil's or Brian's to influence me. So this one took that turn from Heroes and Villains to Be My Baby, and like it was nothing, but that's a cool. Well, it wouldn't be Phil or Brian if it wasn't sleigh bells, Christmas, any time of year type of sound. So to those tambourines, there's times in the song where I'll add some sleigh bells. That quarter note feel just to drive it home. So without the sleigh bells, just the tambourine. Now with. Okay, so that all sounds pretty good. Let's move on to the castanet. Phil Spector definitely uses castanet as if it were hi-hat at times too for this kind of part. You hear that on multiple times in the Wall of Sound songs, and then that's one way to play the castanet. And I think I played that, and I probably had to line it up because I'm not a very good castanet player. So, but then you also have those castanet roll type of things, which sound like this. Yeah, that's a pretty classic device of the Wall of Sound. So, so there's the faster castanet pattern, and then the rolls are more like this. And it wouldn't be a 50s and 60s percussion ensemble if you didn't have some of those teen hand claps. I mean, hand claps just make it, make those teens, it just amps them up, man. You always got to have some hand claps somewhere. And obviously, 80s hand claps or the vibe that they took on in the 80s was much different than like that, car race type of grease vibe that they had going in the 50s and 60s for hand claps. definitely has more of that James Dean type of win that race vibe. Definitely did, I think, at least 2 hand claps. You don't want them to be perfectly on time. A little bit of, natural differences in the rhythm is better. You don't really have to line them up, or at least don't have to line them up much. So 2, you record 2 and you want to get a different spacing. So one clap will be, maybe a 1.5 feet from the mic, and the other one might be like 3 feet from the mic. You could use different mics, but just to get a little bit of a different spacing, and obviously it's going through the echo chamber. So and then the way they used timpanis in the Wall of Sound was pretty cool as well. It would almost blend into like the drummer and the toms and stuff like that. So check out this timpani and how it enhances the groove. Also noteworthy in that part is the cello part doing these sort of slide things that really, this is the 4th verse, so I needed something to ramp up the intensity. But if you listen to that bass part or the cello, you probably crank it up a little bit. Sounds pretty cool. Right here. Together. And check out this bass line here in verse 4. It definitely takes that heroes and villains motif of the Lydian dominant and then makes its own bass line out of it. So check this thing out here. Cool little bass line there. Anyway, the percussion stuff in the Wall of Sound is really fun because it's not about how complicated the part. It's really just this vibe of the tambourine with that echo chamber, or the hand claps, or whatever it is, and they all come together. And like I said, I was picking different songs from the Wall of Sound catalog for different sections, so my song will sound a little bit anachronistic in that sense, where it's not one percussion ensemble throughout although there's a lot of repeating parts, but it's just kind of utilizes the whole shebang. One great Phil Spector recording device, and nothing could be simpler than this idea, but just hearing its execution is fantastic. On the choruses, oftentimes Phil and Brian would mimic this as well. They'd have a low horn, usually like a baritone sax. Sometimes it could be doubled by something like a tuba or a trombone, but mostly the sound was that low baritone sax, pretty much just playing long notes on the bass. Whatever. It just really helps the vibe. So let's hear the chorus of this song with the low horns. Without it. It just sounds so much more Wrecking Crew right when you kick in with that. So that's a cool little feature that comes back lots of times in the song. It's also over here. So that's the low horns. Usually it's the bari sax that carries that. Let's see what else we have in here. There's a little oboe and English horn part that I think just comes in the verses. Right here. pretty simple part. I think there's a couple other parts that use oboe in the song. Oh, we can cover that later. That's like the Baroque part. So anyway, what else do we have in here? We have trombone. So obviously I got the idea from Heroes and Villains to do this sort of Gershwin-esque trombone line, and that's what I do here. It's the same line as Heroes and Villains when the song opens. Here, let me put in the background vocals as well, because this is how the song starts. It takes a Smile a cappella part and puts words to it. She doesn't have to worry, she's a girl. Then we have some trombones that come in here. And that's Mr. Luke Curley on the trombone. I think that's the only parts I use in the song, as a few times that keeps coming back. So there's the trombones. I think there's a little flute part at the end, but geez, it's not very significant if it doesn't come till like 9 minutes into the song. Oh yeah. And that type of flute is more like a mellotron, like a analog synth flute. Sometimes that mellotron flute sounds better than the real thing. And for the strings, I have my buddy Timba Harris, who lives in France and who I played with the Stratosphere for all those years with. He makes a bunch of overdubs, violins, violas, and kind of spreads it out like a section and does a fantastic job with that. I also will mix that with some contact string samples of some of the MIDI parts, and you get this type of sound. Let's hear those by itself. So we have the timba component, which he has kind of pre-mixed for me, which is fine because I have like way too many tracks already. So whenever people hand me something like that's actually already mixed and sounds good and is just like a stereo track I could throw in there, I'm super happy about it. Because if he were to deliver me the 30 tracks that he did to record this, that would just be a problem for me. Anyway, here's that basic string sound there. I take out timba. That's just the fake contact, and timba gives it all that sort of articulation. Nice sounding string part here. That's me on cello and timba and all the rest. Anyway, so the strings sound good. Now, besides that Heroes and Villains groove, boom, 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 there's some delicate, Baroque parts with no drums. So listen to this combination of harpsichord and tack piano. And that's a combination that I got pretty much from listening to Smile. There's that bicycle rider theme, do, 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 where it's hard to tell exactly which instruments Brian's using through that echo chamber, but it sounds like a combination of a harpsichord and a tack piano. So I said, you know what, let's do that. So for this section, there's no drums. It's much more delicate, kind of Baroque Beach Boys type of melody. And both of these are samples, but I'm playing it. So the harpsichord is this one. You can tell it's sampled, but it's a good sample. And when you blend it in with the rest, you can't really tell. And this tack piano sample is really nice, but I'm sending it through that tape echo. It's the one I'm using here, the Echo Boy tape echo. When I listen to Brian's tape echo, it's always that quick slap. God only knows has that on the wood block. He used it all over the place. So anyway, this is a different section. Here's the harpsichord and tack piano together. And now let me bring the basses back in, because Brian used to write these really great bass lines, especially on Smile and Pet Sounds, that had these sort of melodic lead type of parts. So I'm going to put back in those basses that we talked about earlier with tape delay on them as well. So let's check that out. Let's hear just those basses. Harpsichord and tack piano. Okay, so then we also add in some percussion in a unique kind of way. So let's add in the rest of this percussion, and a lot of it is going through that tape delay also. You'll hear the wood block, things like that. So we have a triangle. We also have a gyro where you kind of slide down it. That's right here. Again, here the gyro. And yeah, that's definitely going through that tape delay. We also have mouth pops through spring reverb, this kind of thing. That's something I got from listening to Mr. Bungle California, was how to do those mouth pops, because the mouth pops on California were really sort of an impression of a Beach Boys type of percussion sound. I think the drum solo or the percussion solo for the song Pet Sounds was like a Sparkletts water bottle, like through the echo chamber or whatever. But as far as making the mouth pop sound that's on the Mr. Bungle California record, I didn't see it get made, but I did hear that they were definitely using Furman Spring Reverb. I have an emulation right here on this Altiverb plugin, which is pretty good. I have another good Spring Reverb plugin by Audio Thing now called Springs, which is fantastic, which I didn't have it at this time, but I might have used it. Besides that, on the for the mouth pop instrument, you have to use your mouth and do a low sound, which would be made by and then a high sound would be by stretching it. And you got to play this like a drum. And when that little water drop sound hits that spring reverb, something magic happens. Let me show you the mouth pops track here. First thing I have on it is some EQ. You can see what I'm doing. This isn't very much bass. So I wanted to bring up, 100, 200, 300 to make a nice little bass sound. Let's try it without it so we hear what it sounds like. You can just see it lacks that bass in that drum sound. Next plugin I have is a Kramer Pi, which is some kind of old compressor they used in some famous rock records. I'm not sure, Jimi Hendrix, I'm not sure who it was, but it's kind of an obscure piece, but it has a cool little compression sound. And this is such an uneven, dynamic. It's just going to need a lot of compression, probably more than just that. We have an EQ, which is a Neve, and I'm not even really using the preamp. Cool thing about Neve preamps, though, is you can drive them and get analog distortion like this. In this case, I didn't really need it. I'm just using the high end a little bit. These high end EQs on the Neves are nice. Listen. Pretty easy to find that sweet spot on that one. Then I'm using a saturation. I did this so long ago. I don't know why I just didn't use the saturation on this Neve. Maybe I like this one better. This one's from Softtube, and it's free, I think, or at least it was. And I can get a nice analog saturation sound. Okay, here's without it. And you can see it just adds this warmth. Then I do another Neve. See, I honestly don't know what I was thinking. I'm going to try to justify this. On this one, I still didn't do any preamp gain. I left it at 0, but I did do some rolling off of that low mid. Maybe I did too much on this EQ. But this Neve low mid EQ is really nice. I find that to fit things in the mix, a lot of times I'm having to cut right there at about 220. That sounds pretty good. Then I put a limiter on it just because the dynamics are still so all over the place. And for some reason, I put 1176 just to catch any peaks that weren't caught already. This might be totally superfluous, but... And the thing is, you can just kiss that just a little so it catches those bigger spikes. Now check out this Furman. This has got such a cool character, this Furman spring reverb. So to recreate that Mr. Bungle mouth pop sound from the California album, I think it's a chain that would be something like that. And obviously there's a lot of variations you could do with that. But this sounds pretty cool. And to me, it definitely mimics a Brian Wilson type percussion sound from Pet Sounds. We got a wood block through tape delay. Let's check that out. Okay, so that's the percussion on that section. And I think that's about it. So we have a lot of percussion on the song when you add all that other stuff in that we've already covered. If any of you know the song Zombies, This Will Be Our Year, it's not exactly the same chord progression, but it really is reminiscent of it. So, all right, let's talk about the background vocals. For the background vocals in this long 9-minute song, I decided to start with the verse of Heroes and Villains. It's one of the greatest background vocal parts ever written. It's contrapuntal. It's a beautifully moving melody. It really embodies a very American jazz sort of old-time background vocal, and it is incredibly difficult to pull off as well. So this is Brian Wilson at his peak. I decided, why don't I start with that? I'll do that background vocal on my verse, and then I'll branch off from that and do other things that are maybe derivative of that Heroes and Villains background vocal principle without directly doing the same line. So this is what that Heroes and Villains background vocal that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Yeah, so that's a really nice background vocal, so it works really well in that song. But if you look, let's look elsewhere at the song at the background vocals, and there's some really delicate, nice contrapuntal things that are definitely derivative of that line, but that are just more like drawing on it as a principle type of thing. Of course, had to reference The Boy from New York City. So yeah, you see, I reference all kinds of things kind of at my own whim throughout the course of this 8 or 9 minute song. I forget how long it is. But anyway, that's how the background vocals are used. And there's even a part, if you listen to this, it's very much derived from the principles of that Heroes and Villains line, but is still not it. It's saying she's a girl instead, and the background vocals are just different. Check this out. Then it'll break into a cappella type of thing like here. As I did it with her, did you think about my brother? 'Cause he was first. Now my sister. Yeah, anyway, background vocals. Yeah, it took weeks to do those background vocals. It is a long song and it's very complex. So now check out this little Baroque section in the middle. You got harpsichord. You have a small string section with the same thing with timba on the top strings and me playing the cello. You still have that picked bass or the multiple bass tracks that are going through the tape echo. You have like some oboe and English horn. And that's about it. It's pretty sparse, but it's a nice, pretty part. So check this out. All right, so there is a glockenspiel part. It's just not very consequential. You can hear it just plays, near the intro here. It's also on the chorus. Yeah, so going to be lots of those in that wall of sound texture, so that sounds pretty cool. Now check out this surf lead guitar. So again, sort of hopping around the anachronistic 60s, definitely ripped a page out of one of my favorite producer, Joe Meek's books. This is not the type of sound you'd hear on a Spector recording. Brian was starting to get some pretty gnarly analog tones, but nothing like what Joe Meek was getting over in that apartment or wherever he was recording. Listen to this lead guitar tone. It is very much influenced by Joe Meek. That's pretty cool. And later on there's a there's a lead guitar part. I think it's here. Hear that pizzicato. That was actually a pizzicato string part, but finally I was like, let's just double it on that surf guitar. So that sounds pretty cool. There's something I call the lead organ, and it's a little organ line I got from one of the many versions of Heroes and Villains. So check that out. Oh, don't freeze up on me now. So there's that little Heroes and Villains organ part that I'm sure a lot of you will recognize. There's that comes back a few times. At the very end, there's a theater organ type of thing. That's a contact instrument. Some of the organs in Contact are fantastic. And if you can dirty them up with some, analog overdrive or a tape simulator or something, which is like what I usually do, sounds really good. Let's listen to the transition winds. So this was something I also was inspired by Smile. It had these little transitions out of Heroes and Villains that almost sounded like you were watching a play about American history with like harmonicas and percussion and things like that. So where is this thing? There's like muted trumpets. It just sounds very Americana. And then if we hear that with yeah, it was a little loud in the mix, but you get the point. There's also a point where it changes from straight eighth notes, where it's the third chorus, it switches to swing, and you've got to go pause right here. Listen to the first 30 seconds of "Wait Till My Bobby Gets Home" by Phil Spector, and I swear I imitated the vibe of the piano because it was hard because the chords are completely different. But check out this piano part and how it switches to swing on chorus number 3 here. listen to Wait Till My Bobby Gets Home, oh man, it's not the same part. It's just the vibe of that swing and the piano sort of playing these high voicings, but it sounds really cool. Check out the sound of these two echo chambers that I have chained together here. I have a Altiverb, which is a sample of an echo chamber, and we also have the IK Multimedia Sunset Sound Studio Reverb, which has its own emulation of a echo chamber. So we're going to put the whole mix here, and especially the strings are really going through this, and they sound good. Check this out. If you made it this far, congratulations. Let me recommend that you go check out the actual song. You know, if you haven't heard it, if you've heard all these parts, I'd love for you to hear how it came together. So look for my channel, Tim Smolens' I.S.S. She's a Girl, the official video. You can also hear just the acapella on my channel, She's a Girl acapella, and I will be uploading this instrumental track as well. So I encourage you to check all those out. Please consider joining my Patreon and definitely subscribe below. Thanks for watching.